We're live, and I'm sharing my screen.
Great. Well, welcome everyone for our February 26th meeting of the Assessment and Performance Subcommittee. Thank you all for being here with us. We're going to pick up where we left off last time we met rather. And Kim, I wonder if we can go to the next slide just to remind everyone of our charge, where we're headed with this is ultimately to bring forth a recommendation for discussion to PEPSC. And that will be based on a range of information. And part of that information we're going to hear today from Andy on some of that. Kim, can we go to the next slide? From a timeline perspective, you see where we are. We're on that February 26th. We have a meeting coming up in a month in March. I think by then we'll be putting together the pieces of whatever it is we're going to bring to PEPSC. So we're still in information gathering mode right now. And then ultimately in April is that PEPSC meeting when we'll be bringing this to PEPSC. Thanks, Kim. I think everyone has the law that we're addressing here. So I think that we can move past that. And now what we have are the different pieces of information that we will use in supporting our recommendation. Going through the list, first, we have Andy with us today, who's going to present some information related to data that DPI has on this that I think you'll find really interesting and relevant. I'm working with NCACD. I'm actually meeting with them tomorrow morning to get information from EPP partners on their experience related to Praxis Core. And they also have a little bit of other information too that they're going to share. I think they've done some lit review in this area as well. Then we have, let's see here. Is Ida on with us?
I am.
Hi, Ida. I'm wondering, you had mentioned potentially that you had some information relating to, I'm looking at the slide here. What does POI stand for?
Principal of the Year.
Yeah. Is that something that's still a possibility?
Yeah, since I was the Principal of the Year for our district, so I have an email group with all of the Principal of the Years for every district. So I have their email addresses.
Okay. And that's right. Where we landed on that is there's confidentiality. Yeah. And then I believe also that Tom Tomberlin has connected up with the PANC group on that to explore more anecdotal information around teachers who have been highly effective and yet maybe were not successful with the Praxis Core. Are there any items that we're leaving out here in terms of information gathering? Okay. Then today, as we prepared for this meeting, just so you can all know what's coming, Andy Baxter has joined us, and he has done a lot of work looking through our DPI's data on this. So Andy, you actually have a presentation, right, that you're going to run through for us that kind of slices and dices things in a bunch of different ways to start to get at these issues around the impact of the Praxis Core and the waiver of that year when we didn't have to have the Praxis Core. So I want to make sure, Kim, that I'm on track here. Am I leaving anything out before turning it over to Andy?
No, that is absolutely right.
Okay. So everyone, you sit back, relax, and Andy, we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Randy. And hi, everybody. I work with Kim on her team at DPI, and I do a lot of the data analysis and data visualization for the team, and appreciate the opportunity to look into this. This has been a fun, and I think you will find it interesting topic. I'm going to share my screen, and then we're going to go through a few slides that I put together that look at what we can figure out from our data about the relationship of the core praxis exams to a number of different outcomes. So let me start there. Okay, and let's see. Can you all can see the screen?
We can.
Okay, good. So let's see. There we go. So the first thing, I know you know the law that governs this, but just so that we're all on the same page for the rest of this presentation, for what we're going to be talking about, it only applies to undergraduates, and the undergraduates, have these requirements. They have to either pass all 3 of the core exams, the math, reading, or writing, or if they don't pass all 3, they have to have a total score of 468 or above, or they can have an SAT total score of 1170 or an ACT of total of 24 or above. So that's kind of the key criteria to keep up with. And I should have said, if you have a question, just we have a small number, you can just unmute and interrupt. That would be great. So that's the context. And then what we've got is this kind of anomaly, and we've talked about this. If we look over the undergraduate enrollment into teacher prep programs over the last 10 years or so, what you see is that there was this huge increase in between 2019 or the 18-19 school year and then the 19-20 school year up here, and then a huge decrease after it. And this was something that we were really curious about and caught a lot of the EPP's eyes as well. But you can see it was kind of clipping right along, in the mid-2000s, and then the year that the waiver was in place, it shot way up by 35%, and then the waiver went out, and it went down to 43%. And now we're at this most recent year at about 1900. And we don't know exactly why it shot up that year. It certainly, a lot was going on. There was, the waiver was in place, but the waiver was also in place because of this broader, big thing around COVID. And what we do know is that the number of people who kind of came in when those requirements about the test scores were relaxed, really surged. So what we wanted to do was to kind of look at the people who entered and see, can we learn anything from them to help us see the relationship of core scores to different outcomes that we care about. And so this is what we did. We'll just take a second to go over this. We wanted to look at both the year that the waiver was in place, the 1920 year, and the year, I keep saying the 2021 year, and then the year prior to that, 1920. And we wanted to kind of put everybody into one of 6 groups based on what information we had about their scores. The easiest group would find everybody who passed all their core exams in each of those years. That's this first group. We looked for people who maybe didn't pass all three, but they had the total core score that was high enough. Then we looked for people who had attempted core, but didn't pass either by their total score or by all three. Then we looked at people that we don't have any core data from. We get our data on core either from what the EPPs submit directly or from the test provider, ETS. But these were people that we didn't have any core data on. And we did have some data on their SAT or ACT scores, but that data was lower than what the threshold was for considering them able to enter in a normal year. Our fifth group were people that we had no core data from at all, and we had no SAT or ACT data. And then the last group are people, no core, but they did meet their alternate requirements. So their SAT or ACT was high enough. So that's a mouthful, but what we wanted to do is this is kind of an exhaustive way that we could put each person who came in those 2 years into a bucket so that we could then follow them after they had entered and saw their different outcomes. And this is a table that just kind of shows you how many of these people we're talking about. So we had about 2,773 people who came in the year before the waiver. The next year that jumped, 3,746 came in. If we look at this first row, there were about 20% of the people in 1920 had passed all of their core exams. Another 30% had enough total points on core to pass, and about 7% had failed the core. They got into their programs anyway, and that's a matter of just some kind of leakage around our policy requirements. Then you had roughly 30%, one of the next biggest, roughly 30% of the people had met their SAT requirements. So that kind of gives you the year before COVID, kind of where people fell in these buckets. Then when COVID hit, we got that big surge that we saw in the graph. Then some of the numbers changed a lot. For example, the number of people that we don't have core information from, we don't have alternate requirement data from, went from 5% to close to 21%. The number of people who failed the core stayed about the same, at least as far as we know. And then the no core and low alternate, 28%. So a lot of the people who came in that wave, we just don't have core information from one way or the other. That doesn't mean they failed it necessarily, but it does mean that you just had this big group of people who kind of came in and we're not sure exactly what their core score were. And so we're just kind of putting in this no core and no alternate data bucket. And that'll make sense in a minute. But any questions so far? So then what we wanted to do was look at some information just about, well, what do we know about the people who fall into these different groups? And one of the big concerns nationally, and then I know within our own state, is a question of, do these core exams, do they wind up discriminating against or have a disproportionate impact on different racial ethnic groups? And we find evidence that that is the case for us. If what we've got, if we just look at this table to the left, is we've got all of our different the race ethnicity groups that we track: American Indian, Asian, Black, Hispanic, multiple, people who don't report, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and white. And then here we've got their different categories. So like whether they passed the 3 exams or the total score, or they failed, etc. And we look, a way to kind of see this might be, and I'm going to choose the Black race ethnicity because that's the one that is different from the most other. You had about 16% of the Black applicant candidates, and those that came in those 2 years, about 16% had failed the core. About 22% we had no information for. If you contrast that, so the Black candidates were failing the core at a higher rate than the Hispanics candidates, which was 5.7%, a higher rate than the people of multiple races at 5.2, and a higher than white at 5.6. And all of those differences were, are not by chance, it seems. They were statistically significant. If you are interested and you want to say, well, what percentage of each of the people in each waiver status fell into the which racial or ethnic group, so that now we're looking that the columns are summing to 0, you'd say that about close to 60% of all the people who failed core were white, about 27% were Black, and the rest was kind of scattered among the groups. And that's compared to overall, about 75% of the entrants were white. So it's just these are 2 different, slightly different questions, but the same data, just sliced in different ways. But the big thing that I think you'd say here is that without looking at any outcomes, we know that in general, the people who have failed the core are more likely to be Black than they are to be Hispanic, multiple races, or white. Any questions there? All right. So then let's look at some outcomes. So one of the first outcomes we want to look at was program completion. And Randy, I put this in since we talked in the prep meeting. It's a way to kind of show just overall what happened with completion, what our usual kind of completion rates are, and then to see if that changed any during COVID. Now, this applies to all undergraduates, not anything that is specific around the 6 different groups or the COVID year. And the way to understand, if it's a 0 if they did not complete, it's a 1 if they did complete, and if there's a dot, it means that they are still enrolled. And this, each row is the year that they started their program. So what we could say is that, let's pick 2020, the people who came in 1920, about 84% of those have completed the program. About 13% didn't, and there's a few that are still enrolled. This 84%, 85% is fairly consistent back over time, and that's what we would say is generally the completion rate for undergraduate ed prep programs. In 21, 22, and 23, it gets a little bit tricky figuring out relative to these baseline years if the percentage is changed, because we don't have a lot of time for people to have come all the way through. So overall, the people who entered in 2021, about 72% of those folks have completed. But we're still waiting, and that's lower than what it has been in the past, but we're still waiting on about 520 or so people. And we're not going to know that until next year this time. But Randy, I don't know, you may not, sometimes we say like, oh yeah, I want to look at this, and then we forget that. But does this kind of get a little of what you were hoping to see?
Yeah, Andy, it does. I think the question when we had met last time was like, what's the baseline completion rate? And what I'm taking from this is it's about 85%, and then it did drop down in 21, but there's still some folks who may still complete, and maybe were just delayed, and maybe the pandemic affected that as well.
That's right. That's right. So that's just some background information. And then what we did was we just kind of looked then to see the percentage of each people in each of our groups, these 6 groups, that completed their program or not. And for this, if they were, what we're really looking at is, did they complete or not complete? And we're kind of excluding the people who are still enrolled, because we don't want to count them as either of those yet. And when we do that and we look and see, we know that, for example, about 91%, 90.64% of the people who passed all 3 of their core tests completed their program. And these are the people who came in either 1920 or 2021. About 83% of the people who failed core completed their program as well. But then what we needed to do, so you can kind of see just the averages, but it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison if we just look at the averages. And so what we did, what Randy referred to as kind of, we modeled the estimates so that what we could do is say, if we adjust these, and now let's compare people who entered in the same year and went to the same EPP. So we're comparing people who, say, passed the core versus people who failed the core, but we're now comparing them if they came in the same year and they went to the same EPP. And when we did that, some of the differences go away. What differences there are shown here on this table. The short kind of answer is that we didn't find any statistically significant differences between people who failed the core and people who passed it. What we did find were differences between the people who came in without any information about their core or their alternate requirements. They were consistently had lower numbers than people in the other categories. And we don't know what to make of that. It could be that those people are they're struggling in a way in their program, that they are, but what's interesting is that that group is itself different than the people who failed the core. For example, the group with no data was 7.8 percentage points less likely to complete their program than the people who failed all 3 core exams. So don't know what to make of that, but it is just to show you that where there's differences, it all involves these people, or almost all involves people that came in under the waiver.
Andy, this is Randy. Can I?
Yeah.
I feel this is an important point that you're making here, that the group that is showing a lower completion rate are those who came in, didn't take anything. They didn't take the ACT, the SAT, nor the core, right?
That's close. It's the 100% accurate thing would be is that we don't know if they took the ACT or SAT because we only know it if the EPP reports that, and the EPP was not required to report that in the waiver year.
All right.
Does that make sense?
It does. In contrast, though, those who did take the core and didn't pass, they are not showing a statistically different completion rate than those who passed all 3 exams.
Correct.
So whether or not you passed the core didn't seem to have, did not relate to a difference in completion rate. What did is whether or not you're in this group showing that you took one of the tests.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. And, when you all are ready, or to the extent that you're going to use any of this with, again, we can, to simplify things, we could get rid of the, because this no core, no alt group in terms of our comparisons. But I thought at this stage of the game, when we're really investigating, I thought it was important for you to see. In terms of initial employment, then what we did is we looked at everybody who kind of came in those 2 years, and then we said, did they complete? And if they completed, we kept them. And then we said, let's look at whether they taught within 1 year of completing, which is, maybe evidence of how, appealing they were as a candidate to a principal. And when we looked at this, again, the people who kind of came in under the waiver with no information, this no core, no alt, they were less likely to be employed within a year than people who failed core or who passed with the total score. But in terms of our main comparison between people that we have some core data for, there was, like before with program completion, there are no differences. Then we looked at license exams. And, everybody is supposed to start taking their license exams in the first year after they complete the program. Not everybody does, but we looked at the license exams that they did try, and we just we didn't care how many times they've taken them. We just said, have you passed? Has your best attempt been a passing one yet? And here we did find differences within the groups that we were interested in. We found, for example, that people who failed the core were about 13 percentage points less likely to pass the license exams that they attempted than those who passed the core. 7 percentage points less likely if they had also passed the core, but maybe not by passing all 3 with the total score. And the people who met the alternate requirements, they were way much more likely to pass their license exams than the other groups. Now, our take on this in trying to figure this out is that the license exams, in a way, are just mirroring the core results, right? Like people who had trouble with the core also had trouble with the license exams. And the people who did really well on their SAT or ACT score, they also did really well on their license exams. That's kind of our core takeaway on this. Does that, any questions on that? we were interested in whether this applied to all exams, license exams, or was focused on the content versus the pedagogy. And we found that all of these differences are driven by the content exams. That's where the things like the foundations, the Pearson Foundation of Reading, for example, those types of exams are where the differences in these groups fall. If we look at something like the EdTPA, we find no differences in any of the groups on that. Okay, I can't see people's faces, but are you generally with me? Are you confused about anything?
No.
Okay. I know this is a lot, but this is the beauty of a subcommittee, is you get to really roll up your sleeves and dive in. Now we started to look at outcomes in the classroom, like once they're and so now we're looking just at the people of that group who had completed and got employed within a year. And we looked at, every year, we give this teacher satisfaction or employer satisfaction survey. You may have probably filled this out before for some of your first year teachers, but it's about 20 some items, and the principals are asked how well this teacher does on a variety of teaching tasks compared to the kind of average first year teacher. And when we looked at those, we found no differences among any of the groups in terms of how satisfied the employers were with their first year performance. And the numbers in general, like not only were they not different, the groups weren't that different, overall the numbers are pretty high. So, you had 87% of the people who had kind of come in with or 86% of the people with no core data, no alternate data. Of that group that went on to be employed, about 86% of them were found, the employers were very happy. Then we looked at their evaluation scores, and we looked at their kind of standards 2, 3, and 4, and whether they were proficient or higher on each of those 3 standards, and to see if there were any differences in the groups, and there were no differences. Then we looked at their EVOS composite scores, and to see whether they had met the growth expectations or exceeded versus not, and no differences in those. Then we looked, and Randy, this is slightly different than when we did this in the preview, but that's because we were worried that we didn't have enough statistical power if we just looked at the people in those 2 years. And so we went back a few years, and because people could have, the group that passed the core, but on the basis of their total score, not passing all 3 tests, that group yields a number of people who, for example, failed the math core, but were able to kind of keep going. Ditto for the reading and the writing. So if we go back and pick those people up and then kind of look to see of those people, once they taught, once they had an EVOS score in that same subject, is there any differences that we can pick up? And the answer is we were able to increase kind of our power on that, and we don't find any differences. So another way of saying that is that the people who failed their core math exam were no more or less likely to meet or exceed on their EVOS score in math. The same is true for reading. So passing your reading core exam or not doesn't make you any more or less likely to do well on your reading EVAS score or an ELA related EVAS score. And the same for writing. So to kind of tie all that talking up into just one slide, here's what we feel like we learned from our data about where we compare the people who failed the core with people who passed. The people who failed the core are more likely to be Black than Hispanic, multiracial, or white. They're just as likely to complete the EPP, teach within a year of completing, satisfy their supervisor with their effectiveness, receive evaluation ratings of proficient or above, or meet or exceed student growth. They are less likely to pass content exams. So that's the extent of our looking at this point. I think we feel reasonably confident in these, in these findings. We've had some time to work on it and to look at it, and so with that, I'll turn it over to see if there's any questions or either about what we've shown or suggestions for further work, or did you get what you were looking for?
Andy, I'll start us out with a quick question. Somewhere in there, I think you had an analysis related to EdTPA, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And would that fall into the blue box here of no?
Oh, yeah, that's true. I can put, yeah, I can add that. That's a good insight. So the blue box. Yeah, so what I'll do is just likely to pass pedagogy license exams.
Yeah, and I'm thinking for the subcommittee that's a useful data point in contrast to the less likely to pass content license exams. These are different types of exams, right? So Andy, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Andy, this is Scott. First of all, thank you for putting all this work together, and showing it this way was very helpful and fascinating. So I feel like we're kind of at a cliffhanger, and I would love to hear any theories that you or Tom or Andrew or anyone might have about why the misalignment.
Yeah, so I am not so my first hypothesis, well, maybe the core is just not measuring things that in the end are related to being a good teacher. Maybe it's more measuring being a good test taker, but that's one hypothesis. But we're open. I don't know if Tom or Kim or any of the rest of you.
I don't have any better hypothesis, but I would think maybe the opposite could be true as well.
Okay.
That maybe these other indicators aren't indicative of student outcomes, that maybe the teacher evaluation system isn't really an indicator, or I know the EVOS maybe, growth isn't necessarily an indicator. Maybe those core assessments really are more accurate. I tend to agree with you, though. I tend to put more faith in the others than in the standardized tests. But I don't know. I'd be curious to know other people's hypotheses. But ultimately, that leads to then what do we do about it? What policy recommendations do we make based on this?
Yeah, it's a good point.
Tom has more longer, deeper perspective on all this than anybody I know. So no pressure, Tom.
Wow, that was quite the setup. So this isn't surprising to me because we've looked at this from the licensure exams themselves, and they don't strongly correlate with those outcomes either. So I think there is something to the fact that, testing itself may not be an adequate predictor of future effectiveness. And it's interesting. Several years ago, I had to, I got subpoenaed over something having to do with licensure exams. And, the point that I made then, and I will continue to make, is there's a difference between competency and effectiveness. So competency means you have the knowledge. Effectiveness means you can successfully apply that knowledge to a practical situation. And it could be that this test is measuring exactly what we are asking it to. Do you have the required knowledge, the requisite knowledge to be a teacher in a given subject area? And we're comparing that knowledge to their ability to apply that knowledge successfully. And that's where it seems, I think, the mismatch might be, is like everybody who knows something can't actually do something. And I fully recognize that I'm walking into that old adage that we all hate. Those that can do, and those who can't, something about it, just those who can't teach or something like that. You guys know what I'm talking about? Have you ever heard that old saw? Yeah. So I think that's the heart of what we're talking about here. And if we want to be predictive of somebody who's going to be successful in the classroom, I think these kinds of gateway measures, if we're even interested in keeping some kind of gateway, is something more to do with practical application of knowledge rather than specific, just general knowledge tests. I don't know.
I agree with all of that, Tom. And just from my own experience working with beginning teachers, and working with teachers who, needed additional time to work through the licensure process, that don't always correlate to student outcomes. Some of the very best teachers were, actually had strong core, as we're calling it here, content knowledge, but were couldn't convey it very well. The pedagogy was lacking, or the opposite. But the best teachers were the ones that built their content knowledge as they built their pedagogy. And I would say, kind of getting to the eventual possible decision making here is that as many different ways that we can offer to teachers to demonstrate their competency and their knowledge is good. So if we have teachers who just knock it out of the park on the 3 core tests, great. And those may or may not become effective teachers, but it looks like there's some correlation there. But if they can't, that we find some other ways for them to demonstrate it, because many of them will.
This is Ida. I just would like to add the fact that this data does go to show that the mentoring that we're doing with beginning teachers has improved so much recently that I think that it's showing in these outcomes for NEPSIS and EBOS, even if they are not passing the core exam. I think that they have the instructional coaching and the mentoring in place that's helping them to become better in the classroom.
Ms. Weisner, I don't begrudge you at all your perspective on this, but I'm concerned that there might be other data coming forth soon that might take a different position on that.
And I am just speaking from my personal knowledge within my own building, so I completely understand and respect that.
All right, just so we'll remain friends if I have to dispute that particular.
No, completely understand and respect that. I'm just speaking from within my building.
Yeah, I get you. That's good. I mean, that is very good to hear. All
I can agree with both of you. You know, watching my wife, who's a 28-year middle school teacher, trying to mentor 7 beginning teachers right now, that when you have a high quality, you know, she's a national board master degree, you know, high growth EVOS teacher, when she can work with 2 or 3 teachers, they seem to really thrive. But when she's one of trying to work with 6 or 7, it just doesn't, the effectiveness isn't there. And I would say that the latter may be more the common experience across the state. We have fewer veteran teachers trying to mentor more beginning teachers than ever before. Again, thanks, Andy.
Oh, you're welcome. You know, I think the one thing is you all, you know, take your recommendations forward and everything, just from a data perspective. Even if we had found big effects on this, we're always going to have those, even the, like, if we found big effects, those effects would be based on averages, right? And we are always going to be able to find people who our experience of them is different than what the average would be, right? Like, they failed the core, but they were great, or they passed the core, and they were horrible. Like, you know, like you have that, you'll always have those incidences. What we're showing here is that even on average, those distributions are so close to each other that we can't tease out any real overall differences.
Thanks, Andy. I just want to make sure that none of the other subcommittee members have questions. And Tracy, I think you may be the only one so far who hasn't chimed in after Andy's presentation. I just want to make sure that you have an opportunity to do so if you want to.
I don't have any. I've just been listening and looking over the data with everybody. So,
All right. Thanks, Tracy. Well, I'm wondering if we have to make a decision in terms of how we move forward in terms of using this information in putting forth a recommendation to PEPSC. What's the group's sense? Do you feel that there is information here that would be in support of a recommendation to discontinue the use of the Praxis core in its current usage?
This is Scott, just because nobody else is talking. I mean, is that, I'm sorry that I missed the last meeting. I was out of state, but is it the case that we need to completely discontinue use of it because of this disconnect, or that it continues to be one of several ways for teachers to fulfill the requirement?
Scott, that's an interesting question. I'm wondering if we could get guidance on that from others who are on the call, and I'm thinking of our friends at DPI.
So I'm sorry. So the question is, are we limiting the discussion to the Praxis core or any other perceived barriers, gateways to admission to an EPP?
I think that, yeah, I was sort of asking the same question. And again, I apologize for last time. And ultimately, would like to know what DPI staff recommend, and likely would support that, unless the purpose of the meeting is for you to get that from us. But I mean, I'm in favor of as many gateways to entry as possible. If that means keeping it, but it not being necessarily exclusive, maybe that if the waivers become permanent, if you will.
Yeah, so I think I speak for most of the folks on this, DPI folks on this call, that, in terms of inputs into the EPP process in general, we are much more supportive of outcome measures, giving EPPs the flexibility to recruit and enroll whomever they choose based on their own individual criteria. DPI's preference is to measure those decisions based on the outcomes, not on the inputs. So that's generally the position we've taken in a lot of these conversations, and would likely maintain. So all these things, and that goes to the licensure exams as well, is we don't object to a licensure exam as one possible way to demonstrate competency to hold the license, but feel like there are others there are other measures that we could employ to establish that competency other than just the licensure exams. So we're not, I guess that's a very long-winded way of saying we would not in any way, if this was your recommendation to PEPSC or the board, I don't think DPI would step in to say we're not supportive of this.
Thanks, Tom. So what I'm hearing, to Scott, to your question, is that if this subcommittee did want to recommend that the praxis core not be required, but could continue to be one route, that is a possibility for us to pursue. And Scott, am I getting at your question?
Yeah, that's great. And I like Tom's answer very much too, which is that, if it's not necessary and it isn't really helping on the front end, and it's more effective and efficient to just do away with it, then that would be fine too. Yeah.
And I do think, Scott, that's where I do think the initial thinking of the subcommittee as we launched was we were thinking of more along the lines of what evidence out there suggests that it shouldn't be used, was more the way we were thinking about it. So you raise an interesting question. Could it still be used, but used in a different way?
Well, I won't be the one here to stand to defend the standardized tests. So, I'm happy to go along with a recommendation to eliminate them if that's what the committee wants, and we don't find much evidence for keeping it, and DPI wouldn't object to it. I was just raising it as a question,
So for our other subcommittee members, do you, I'm just going to pose the question again, do you feel like based on this analysis, it's worth us pursuing using this data and the results of it to be included in our recommendation to PEPSC as one of the points of evidence for discontinuing the use of the praxis core?
I would say yes.
Thanks, Tracy. Ida, any thoughts on this?
I'm sorry, my bell was ringing at school, so it was kind of noisy. I just typed in the chat that I agree with that as well. I think this data is beneficial.
Thanks, Ida. All right. Kim, I think where we're at here is, in the remaining minutes that we have, is just wrapping things up and heading towards our next meeting.
Okay, fantastic. So our next meeting is March 28th from 2 to 3.
Yep. So to the subcommittee members, where I'm seeing this going is that we can start to put together information. It might be a draft recommendation that we can begin to pull together over the coming weeks with the different pieces of evidence that we have, this being one of them. Other evidence will be coming in over the next couple weeks. And then that is what we can discuss when we next meet, is that information taken together along with our particular recommendation and the wording of that recommendation. I'm curious about how that sounds to everyone. Anyone opposed to that?
Scott said he likes it.
Great. All right. So not hearing any opposition to that, I think seems like the direction that we're going. Andy, thank you so much for your help with
You're
this.
welcome.
Will we be able to, Kim, can we forward on these slides at this point?
Oh, yes, I'm going to email them right after this.
Fantastic.
We just wanted everybody to have the context, Andy's context, along with the slides before you receive the slides.
That's great. Kim, what am I leaving out?
I think you're good to go, Randy.
Good to go. Anything else from our subcommittee members? All right, hearing nothing then, I want to thank you all for your time. I know you're really busy and there's other places that you could be. We're grateful for the time that you gave us today. Kim, as always, thanks for all of your help, and to all of our DPI teams and partners, thanks for all that you're doing. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you in a few weeks.
Thank you, guys. Take care.